Hi, everybody. Brad Truax here from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. Since it's fall, it's an appropriate time to begin to talk about acorns and other hard masts that are so important to our wildlife as they prepare for the winter months. Hard mast actually comes in two forms. Mast refers to the edible or reproductive parts of forest trees and shrubs. And again, we classify mast as either hard mast or soft mast. Hard mast consists of nuts like acorns, beech nuts, and hickory nuts, whereas soft mast consists of things like raspberries and blueberries. And both types of mast are extremely important as nourishment for many wildlife species. So, what is hard mast? As we mentioned, it consists primarily of nuts like acorns, beech nuts, and hickory nuts. And the hard mast provides really crucial nourishment for many wildlife species here at Eastman. Hard mast is most available in the fall. Uh, Many animals and birds need it to increase their energy reserves in preparation for winter. The cyclical nature of hard mast production plays a key role in determining the wildlife populations. So again, today we're going to talk about acorns, beech nuts, and hickory nuts. Uh, the mighty oak, is the oak a keystone species? Okay, remember the concept of a keystone? That's a wedge-shaped block that holds up an arch. If you remove that keystone, the entire structure crumbles. Well, the analogy also applies to ecological systems. So if you have a keystone species and it's removed, it can affect a broader ecology. And there are certainly certain biological keystones, beavers almost anywhere, salmon in Alaska, elephants in the savanna, wolves in Yellowstone. So is the oak a keystone species? Absolutely. So the oak as a keystone species means that it's critical for the ecology of the forest. An oak tree can live for hundreds of years and it can produce about 3 million acorns over a lifetime. That's an incredible amount. And those acorns provide essential food for dozens of bird species, also for bears, deers, raccoons, opossums, rodents like squirrels and mice, and even insects like weevils. Oak leaves also feed the caterpillars of over 500 species of moths and butterflies. And caterpillars, in turn, contain high protein and lipid content, and they're critical, provide a critical food for birds that feed their young so that the young birds can grow and develop. And of course, are also important for building ships, homes, and furniture. Oaks are also involved in a trophic cascade. This is a great story. An acorn grows into an oak tree. Well, the oak tree then grows and it sheds more acorns. An acorn weevil finds an acorn on the ground, drills a hole in the acorn, and removes the insides. But then there are certain ants called acorn ants that actually move into the hollow acorn and propagate from there. Those ants then live aside aphids on various plants, and the aphids feed on the sap of the plants and they secrete a liquid known as honeydew. Well, that honeydew is a sugar-rich substance, and the ants are drawn to it, and they harvest it as a food source. And in return, the ants actually protect the aphids from predators like ladybugs. But ultimately, harvester butterfly larvae, basically the caterpillars of the harvester butterfly, actually eat the aphids. And it's interesting, the harvester butterfly really is the only butterfly that's a carnivore. And ultimately, the harvester butterfly emerges from that caterpillar stage. So that's quite a journey from a single acorn up to a harvester butterfly. That's known as a trophic cascade. And this, I happened to come across this picture, which actually illustrates that. It's showing the aphids, which are right here on a leaf. They're secreting honeydew, which is that very sugar-rich substance. The ants love the honeydew. They're actually protecting the aphids from ladybugs, but they can't protect the aphids from the harvester caterpillars, which are here, which ultimately eat the aphids. Okay, so acorns come from oak trees, and they contain large amounts of protein, carbohydrates, and fats. So they're really excellent choices for wildlife to eat, particularly as the wildlife is preparing for winter. Acorns are also good sources of minerals like calcium, phosphorus, and potassium, and some vitamins like niacin. The total energy content of an acorn varies by species, but all compare very well to other wild foods and with some of the other nuts that they may eat. But acorns also contain tannins, which have a bitter taste and can have some unwanted side effects in certain animals. Some animals, like squirrels and jays, cache the acorns, and they may wait for groundwater to percolate through the acorns, and that removes the tannins, which are that bitter substance, before the squirrels or jays eat them. Different squirrel species may cache differently. For instance, red squirrels tend to have a single cache, whereas gray squirrels often have multiple caches. And because acorns are too heavy to be dispersed by wind, it's usually dispersal of the seeds by squirrels and jays that's important in seeding those acorns elsewhere so that they can grow into oak trees. And when squirrels and jays are caching the acorns, they'll lose some of them. And some of those lost acorns can then germinate and lead to new oaks via that mechanism. So acorn production varies from year to year. It's kind of a boom and bust cycle. Oak trees produce acorns roughly 4 out of every 5 years. Red oak trees produce acorns every other year, and it takes about 2 years for these nuts to mature, leading to big acorn crops roughly every 4 to 10 years. And some look at this cyclical nature to be an evolutionary asset. The thinking goes something like this. They're trying to thwart what we call seed predators. So if they produce few acorns, the population of squirrels, mice, and other wildlife that eats those acorns will drop off the next year. So the next year, the trees provide many acorns, and since there are now fewer animals around to eat them, the likelihood is that some of the new seedlings will actually be planted and grow into new oak trees. So again, the effect of these boom and bust cycles is felt throughout the wildlife community. When they produce few acorns, the population of squirrels and mice and voles and other small animals is going to be smaller the following year. But other animals like the red fox and owls rely on those smaller animals as food sources. So their population is going to be smaller until the population of squirrels and mice increases again. So during a boom year, there will be more mice and squirrels and voles, and you're going to see an increase in raptors and predators. So a boom year does have consequences for humans too. Uh, the white-footed mouse, they increase in number, and the tick population that feeds on those mice will go up as well. And if you have more ticks, that means there are going to be more ticks carrying Lyme disease, which means there's going to be an increase in Lyme disease in humans. So again, the cyclical nature, these boom and bust cycles of acorns has impact not only on the wildlife community, but on humans as well. So when the cycles collide, the effect of those is felt throughout the community. Beech trees also produce beech nuts every other year. And again, we mentioned before that oak trees produce acorns usually 4 out of every 5 years. And when those two off-year cycles overlap, which historically happens about every 8 to 12 years, there's all of a sudden a dearth of hard mast in the forest for the wildlife to consume. And such an overlap occurred in the fall of 2018 and the winter of 2019. Some people called that Squirrel-mageddon because squirrels weren't able to get enough of this hard mast to survive, so their numbers went down considerably. And moreover, in such doubly down years, the food source for bears dries up, and that sends them into to hunt in human-occupied areas for food. Some of our 2022 increase in human-bear interactions was likely due to that dearth of hard mast that occurred in the forest. That was probably a down year for both acorn production and beechnut production. So much of that 2022 increase was due to that double down year for hard mass production. Uh, when those primary food sources out in the forest dried up, the bears started looking for food in our human occupied areas. So, what happened after 2022? Well, the bear encounters peaked at Eastman in 2022. In the fall of 23 and throughout 2024, we've had far fewer bear encounters. And why? That's because all of a sudden, well, first of all, Eastman's board did pass several measures that were important regarding bears. They basically said no feeding the bears, and residents must secure their trash and grills. But the key thing was that 2022 was a bust year for acorns, whereas 2023 was a boom year, or what some people call a mast year. So the bears now have lots of their favorite food in the fall was plentiful in the forest, both in 2023 and hopefully again here in 2024. So Eastman still does issue frequent reminders about bringing in your bird feeders when the bears are active and not feeding the bears and securing your trash and grills. Okay, beech nuts are another form of hard mass. This is showing beech nuts. They fall from beech trees in autumn, and they have a very rich oil content. And in addition to that fat content of almost 40%, they contain many minerals that are important, such as iron and zinc. And they serve as a nutrient-dense food source for bears, white-tailed deer, wild turkey, ruffed grouse, wood ducks, woodpeckers, and more than a dozen other mammals and birds. They often do have a bitter taste because of those tannins that I mentioned, and some of them contain a toxin called phagan. Beechnuts do have a cyclical pattern, very much like the acorns do. And again, the beech trees produce acorns every other year, and their cycles are somewhat shorter than the cycles for oak trees producing acorns. But again, once about every 10 to 12 years, there's a bust year for both beechnut production and acorn production. And that creates a crisis for many of the wildlife species that are dependent on it. So beechnuts and bears, beechnuts are also a favorite food source for bears. And beechnuts have about twice as much protein and calories per edible portion compared to acorns. So these are actually a very good food source for bears. And there's a pattern of synchrony between beechnuts and bear cub production. Very interesting. So on alternating years when the beechnuts are scarce, young female bears that were near breeding age would not be as fat going into the den, so they wouldn't give rise to any, it wouldn't give birth to any cubs. And as a result, alternating years of nut-rich conditions were eventually reflected in the timing of bear cub litters, and the two were in synchrony. So most of the cubs born in winter following a good beechnut year, whereas following a bad beechnut year, you'll have few cubs born. Beech trees are in peril. Beech bark disease has been here for many years, and that really doesn't kill many beech trees. On the other hand, beech leaf disease, which is caused by a roundworm, does kill beech trees. And beech leaf disease has arrived in New England, and this could lead to a critical loss of a critical food source for many wildlife species in the future. Hickory nuts are another form of hard mast. These are members of the walnut family. And hickories are robust deciduous trees with many desirable qualities. We don't seem to have a lot of hickory trees here at Eastman. Some of them reach heights of 80 feet with large grounds, and they're slow growing and live long. Some live for up to 500 years. And because they grow so slowly, their wood is extremely dense and hard. Hickory fruits begin as small green balls in summer, and they may contain a single seed, a beige colored nut surrounded by a thick or thin hull. And at the onset of fall, these fruits turn brown. They begin to fall to the ground as beech nuts. So hickory, I'm sorry, begin to fall to the ground as hickory nuts. And hickory nuts are often infested with the larvae of weevils, and birds love to eat those weevil grubs. A whole host of wildlife species, black bears, foxes, mice, chipmunks, squirrels, rabbits, and a number of birds enjoy hickory nuts every fall. And during bust years for acorns and beech nuts, bears have to move around more in search of food. And they also forage for less desirable masts, such as hickories and walnuts. Pine cones, when we talk about hard mast, we're usually talking about nuts coming from hardwood or some softwood trees, but we usually don't think about conifers when we're discussing mast. But in reality, pine cones probably could can be considered hard mast. There are many birds like woodpeckers, turkeys, and crossbills, plus squirrels and even deer that do eat pine cones and the seeds that are within the pine cones. So why do we have so many pine cones this year? Many of you have noticed there's been a bumper crop of pine cones in New Hampshire this year. And our white pines probably do have mast years when the trees do produce a large number of cones. And these occur every few years. Obviously, this past year has been a boom year for pine cones. That's why you're seeing so many on your property and in the forest. So 2023 was likely a mast year for pines. And actually, all those pine cones you're seeing are actually female pine cones. They're the ones that produce the seeds. And the male pine cones are yellowish in color, and they grow in little spike-like clusters that produce the pollen. And then they fall off the trees after pollination. And that's usually in later May or June when you see lots of green pollen basically covering everything. And squirrels and some birds feed on those pine cones. And some birds' beaks are ideally suited for extracting seeds from those cones. For instance, turkeys and quails readily seek and eat those pine seeds. So squirrels and some birds do feed on the pine cones. We mentioned the birds' beaks may be very useful for extracting those seeds. But again, red squirrels are quite fond of pine seeds, and they often stack piles of pine cones very high. In fact, one red squirrel stashed over 50 pounds of pine cones under the hood of a car. Okay, all those pine cones that you see on the ground are female. That's showing right here. And the male pine cones are these little yellow things that show up in clusters, and they open up and release the pollen in the springtime. So why so many pine cones this year? Well, 2023 was probably a mast year for the pine cones. Some experts also say that hot, dry weather conditions in 2022 growing season may have stressed the white pines and caused them to increase their cone production in 2023. And then there's the insect defense theory that some of these cycles are ways of avoiding predators, such as insects. And if the cycles are unpredictable, the insects can't adjust to it. So hard mass does affect multiple species. Again, it reverberates up the food chain. For example, after a season when there's a paucity of hard mass, the population of those small mammals that feed on the mast is going to be reduced. And then the red fox population that actually feeds on those small animals is going to be reduced the following season. And likewise, after a boom year for hard mass, there are going to be more small mammals. And then the following year, the red fox population is going to recover. So again, the bottom line, understanding these hard mass cycles explains many of the woodlands and wildlife phenomena that we see here in Eastman. So we hope that you've gotten something out of this. It is fall. We're going to see a lot of hard mast, hopefully in the forest, and hopefully this will be a good year for hard mast and produce plenty of food for our various wildlife species.